So it's an honor and a privilege to be here. It's nice to actually get to see Jennifer in America. I don't think that I've ever seen you in America, but we've crossed paths a number of times in Dakar at the West African Research Center. And for those of you who don't know the place, it's an extraordinary place that serves as a kind of meeting point, site of discussion and debate, bringing together African intellectuals, sometimes classically trained Muslim intellectuals, Western scholars, university folks, students. It's a really sort of wonderful place. So this is my plug for WARA, which is an institution that I first came to know actually as an undergraduate in Dakar on an undergraduate research project in 1996. So I can say that over a very long span, it's been a really wonderful institution that's doing really important work. So it's nice to be able to give a plug for it here. So as Jennifer mentioned, I'm going to be talking essentially from a forthcoming book. The book is finished. I'm doing the index, but it probably won't be out until February or March. It'll, as part of the first run of UNC Press's spring run. The book is a history of Qur'an schooling, but it's not just an institutional history. It's a story that uses Qur'an schooling as a window onto Muslim epistemology, onto an inquiry into what it means to know in Islam, and how that has been worked out practically within a West African context. The book is about epistemology. The basic premise of the basic argument for why Qur'an schooling is a valuable window onto epistemology is that it's a good place to look for what people think knowledge is. If you look at the moment that they're trying to pass it from one generation to the next. People talk about knowledge all the time. They write about it. They write treatises about it. But as someone who's trained primarily as a social historian and also kind of as an anthropologist, in spite of myself, my PhD advisor had PhDs in both fields, and so he snuck an anthropology training into my graduate training. I like to pay attention to what people do when they're constructing institutions, when they're transmitting knowledge and approaches to knowledge. So the book is an inquiry into the history of Qur'an schooling. It spans about 1,000 years of West African history, from the first documented instances of Qur'an schooling in West Africa right down to the present. So it's about epistemology, but it's also about history. It's essentially an attempt to understand the philosophy of knowledge that's animating Qur'an schooling, and then actually to try to write a history from within this epistemology. One that has all of the footnotes and all of the sort of standard trappings of academic histories, but that nonetheless tries to see through the looking glass of epistemological history and write from within what I argue is essentially an epistemology of embodiment within the Islamic tradition. Can you go to the next slide? So it's a history of Qur'an schooling, among other things. It's a history of this institution known in Wolof as the Dara, which is maybe the one in front off and the one.
Yeah, just the one in front off. Is that possible?
This is fine. Can you guys see? Then maybe leave this one out.
That's
okay.
You're the one. That's okay.
See, right?
No,
Can you see up?
I can do this in my sleep.
Oh, okay.
I wrote this book, and so I know it pretty good. The most important thing is that you guys be
Is
able
that
to
okay
see
for
me,
you,
and then
Corey?
you guys be
I
able to
think
see
this is the
the.
best mix.
Yeah, it's fine.
Lights in the back.
I don't know if the video will be able to capture
Is
me,
that
but
okay
maybe
for you,
that's for
Corey?
the best. I didn't shave before I came, so it's looking
No,
a
it's
little
okay.
rough today.
It's okay. Yeah. All right.
Okay, so it's a history through this institution. The what's known in Wolof as the Dara, which is usually explained as the etymology of the word Dara in Wolof is usually explained as deriving from Dar al-Qur'an, house of the Qur'an. In Fula, in the Fula languages, this is usually referred to as a dudal. Dudal is a hearth, and this refers to the firelit study sessions of Qur'an students. The day in Qur'an school For students like these that live with their teacher, usually begins around 4:30 in the morning, studying around the fire before the morning prayer, and oftentimes a large amount of the time actually consecrated to Qur'an memorization was spent during these early morning hours and also after the sunset prayer and into the night. So the symbol of the Qur'an school, in a certain sense, was its hearth. And this wonderful novel, Ambiguous Adventure, people have read Ambiguous Adventure? Yeah, he chooses the term the glowing hearth to refer to the Le Foyer Ardent for the Qur'an school, and he's making a play on words. This is actually the name of the Qur'an school in Fula. Can you advance to the next one? Explaining the title. So I'm going to get into why I see the classical epistemology of Islam as being one that's rooted in embodiment, and I'm going to get to why I think there's a lot of evidence for West African schooling preserving this classical approach. But before I sort of get into the details, I want to explain the title itself. So the title is drawn from a famous hadith, wherein Aisha, one of the Prophet's wives, was asked to describe the character of her husband to an interlocutor who had not known him in life. And there's two kind of prominent strains of this particular hadith. In the first, Aisha responds by asking him a question. You know, she's no stranger to the arts of rhetoric. She's one of the most important intellectuals in Islamic history, even though she's often sort of shortchanged in that role. So she's no stranger to the arts of rhetoric. She answers a question with a question. What was he like? And she says, have you read the Qur'an? And he says, yes, I've read the Qur'an. And she says, then you know his character. His character was the Qur'an. And this hadith is very commonly circulated. You'll hear it in sermons, you'll hear it in moralizing contexts in lots of parts of the Muslim world, but less frequently cited is the one that comes along with this one in some collections, where she elaborates on the point further, because character is an abstract thing. In the other narration, she says, he was the Qur'an walking on the earth. The idea being that it wasn't just his character that was animated by the spirit of the Qur'an, but in fact that the Qur'an was a thing that was inside him, something that he carried within himself. And in fact, the terminology used to describe people who memorized the Qur'an, people who studied the Qur'an, and this is essentially the goal of Qur'an schooling, is to get people to memorize and internalize the Qur'an. The most commonly used term to describe those people in the early days, the most commonly used terms in the early days of Islam were hifz and hamd. The first meaning to keep, to protect, to hold. The second literally meaning to carry. The idea is that the person who memorizes the Qur'an is safeguarding it, preserving it, carrying it within their very being. And the basic argument of the book is that the goal of Qur'an schooling from the earliest days of Islam down to the present in West Africa was to create this kind of internalization and embodiment of the book within those who are there to memorize the Qur'an. It's to remake the children of Adam. Domi Adama is the usual way to refer to a person in Wolof. I mean, Nit, I suppose, is a more simple term, but the children of Adam is a generic term for referring to people, and I tend to think sometimes in Wolof. So remaking the children of Adam as living exemplars of the Qur'an was the basic aim behind Qur'an schooling. So how am I going to substantiate this claim? Can you go to the next? So this is a... and then can you just, this is a contemporary Qur'an school in Futa Toro, a place that I worked for a certain amount of time. Can you go 2 slides back? Now go 2 slides forward. 100 years difference, and not a lot ostensibly has changed. One of the arguments that I'm going to make is that Senegambian and West African Qur'an schooling more generally has been an extraordinarily tenacious scholarly tradition. People are not giving up on the basic practical material elements of Qur'an schooling. They change them it's not it's not a thing that people rush headlong into. And people have very specific reasons for keeping children in the kinds of seated postures, for using these wooden tablets, for laying them across the knees, for teaching in this particular sort of way, which they trace and which can be sort of traced back to the very earliest days of Islam. So let's go ahead to the next one. Okay, so how do I substantiate this claim? The book is based on a bunch of different sources. It started out as a PhD thesis that was really focused on the 20th century and then sort of bled into the 19th, and it was a history of Qur'an schooling basically in colonial and post-colonial Senegal. And since I defended that thesis a number of years ago, I sort of focused much more intensively on the pre-colonial period and diversified the source base. But the original source base was drawn from about 90 hours of interviews with people who grew up in Qur'an schools conducted over 18 months of field research in Senegal in 2001, 2002. It's also drawn, as I mentioned, from sort of a participant observation in Senegambian Muslim society, not only in that large field research stint, but in multiple trips both before and after. Yeah, essentially, my kids studied the Quran this way, and yeah, in a bunch of specific ways. You can ask me about them later if you want to. Became a part of Senegambian Muslim society in a very particular way. Autobiographical narratives were also really helpful. I think that a key find in the dissertation research was coming across these cahiers ponti, which are secondary school take-home examination essays that were written by students at a colonial secondary school between the 1920s and the 1940s. And as it happened, for a span of years, one of the essays that they could write was an autobiographical narrative about their time spent in Quran school. So there were 14 of these, ranging in length, usually from between 40 and 100 pages, that detailed every single element of the material life. That spent a lot of time on the figure of the teacher. That talked a lot of, there was a lot of, sort of interiority in many of these narratives. So these mostly came from, like I said, the earlier colonial period. So these allowed me to have a kind of set of first-person witness about what life was like in Quran schools. And on the basis of that, I crafted a kind of historical ethnography of Quran schooling spanning the 20th century. And that's an important part of the book. But adding to that was archival research in Senegal, France, London, a really major find actually at the University of Michigan Library. I'll tell you guys about that later. And then expanding, once I started to realize that this was a book that really had to speak to the history of knowledge in Islam with a capital I, then it also became, extending my inquiry into some of the practices that I was finding in Quran schooling, looking for antecedents in classical and medieval Arabic works on education, in histories, regional Arabic language histories from West Africa, some recorded early oral traditions, recent Arabic works on education written by Senegambian Muslims. We're losing the very bottom line, but it's not a big deal. So it's a diverse set of sources that spans basically the period from about 800 CE, are the earliest sources, right down to the present. Can we go ahead? Don't memorize this. You're not in Quran school, but just a quick outline. There's the introduction, conclusion, and 5 chapters. The first is basically talks about what the Quran school is, and it makes an argument for recentering African Muslims in discussions of African studies and Islamic studies. From there, there's a kind of historical ethnography that talks about the key ideas of embodiment, and then from there, it's basically a history in chronological order, running right down to the present, with a conclusion that I'll get to in just a minute. Go ahead to the next one. Each chapter in the book is framed by a saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. And so I'm giving you the sayings up front so you can start to decipher and guess at what you think the meanings might be. The introduction is framed by this saying, emulate the blacks, for among them are 3 lords of the people of paradise. Luqman the sage, the Negus of Abyssinia, and Bilal the Muezzin. The first chapter, if the Qur'an were on an untanned hide and was thrown into a fire, it would not burn. That might be my favorite. The ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr. I fudged a little on this one. People often refer to it as a hadith. It's probably a saying coined by Hassan al-Basri, the early Sufi thinker, but I'm going to go with it anyway. This one is very clearly has good roots in hadith. Chapter 3, whoever frees a believing slave, God will free his every limb from the fire as he has freed those of the slave. Chapter 4, the nobility of my community are the people of the Qur'an. Chapter 5, a man without any bit of the Qur'an in his belly is like a broken down house. And the conclusion, the people of the West will keep triumphantly following truth until the hour arrives. Go ahead. So I'm going to go quickly through most of these and actually just linger on a few. The introduction is basically uses this hadith to make a rhetorical point. If the Prophet of Islam considered Africans as exemplars of knowledge and piety in Islam, then it's about time that African studies and Islamic studies did so as well. That most of the literature on Islam in Africa, generally in West Africa specifically, tends to approach its object through a lens of syncretism. It continues to exoticize African Islamic practice as if it's a thing that's unusual, as if it's a thing that is essentially rooted in pre-Islamic religious traditions, or rooted in some way that is never really fully fleshed out in African cultural idioms. And it essentially builds upon previous forms of racial discourse that were meant to, for lack of a better word, anathemize African Muslims. First Arab and Muslim racial discourses, I talk about some of these in that piece in the Cambridge World History of Slavery, about slavery in Islamic Africa, but also European colonial racism and Orientalism, which in the 19th century really started to portray Islam as the property and proper expression of the Arab genius, and animism as something that was almost biologically predetermined in African societies. So that it was a thing that could not be removed. And I go into a number of arguments reading through anthropological and historical literature, still focusing largely on embodiment to frame it, but basically to show some of the ways in which African and Islamic studies have been heirs to particular legacies of racializing discourse. The basic argument is that a blind spot developed at the intersection of Islamic and African studies, and the black Muslims disappeared in it. They're not really fully seen by either field. And this has been because largely because it was essentially impossible for the many of the sort of progenitors of those two fields to understand an African Muslim as authentically African and authentically Muslim at the same time. that was an incongruity that was not ever named, and so since it wasn't named, it was never resolved. Instead, it was just acted upon. And I go into a number of examples. You can ask me about them later, but I want to keep things moving because there's more interesting parts to the book, I think, than this. You'll ask me about the picture, and it's coming back. One of the reasons why people need to pay more attention than we currently do is that Africa is probably the only continent in the world that has a Muslim majority. Even the most conservative estimates, suggest that the total population of the African continent is something like 44 to 48% Muslim. But realistic estimates suggest that there's probably a pretty significant Muslim majority in Africa. And contrary to what many people might think, there are far more Muslims living south of the Sahara Desert than north of it. More than 120 million more south of the Sahara than north of it. In fact, they dwarf the number of Muslims living north of the Sahara. There's more Muslims in Nigeria than there are in Egypt. There's more Muslims in Ethiopia than there are in Iraq. There's a higher percentage of Muslims in Senegal than there is in Syria. I could go on, and actually, if you take my Islam in Africa class, I do. But the point is just to say that, and this number is growing, by the way, both as a percentage of the overall population and in relation to other religious traditions within Africa. So pay attention, because this whole thing could be black, no pun intended, sooner than we might think. Go ahead. The picture, this is actually in the book, and this is just an image meant to highlight, the point about the hadith. This is from a 16th century Turkish history that shows Bilal climbing to the top of the Kaaba when the Muslims returned victorious to Mecca and making the call to prayer for the first time. So I like the image. I see it as sort of symbolic, and I go into some detail about it in the introduction. Go ahead. I also talk about so there's formatting issues here. I guess the font that I was using didn't get imported. All right. In any case, I talked about hanging on to some of the basic material elements of Qur'an schooling. How many people have seen these wooden tablets? Where have you seen them? Say again?
Nigeria.
Yeah, they're very, very common in West Africa. Anybody that's been to West Africa has seen them. They're almost impossible to find in many, many Muslim societies these days. You can find them in a few places in East Africa. People talk about them in recent memory in Morocco. They talk about them in recent memory in Algeria, but they don't see them very often. This is still the primary means of transmitting the Quran for most West African Muslim students right down to the present. Lawh is the ordinary Arabic word, alluwah is one of the Arabic plurals, and alluwah is the ordinary Wolof term. These are the ones my daughters used. They didn't write them, the teacher wrote them for them. I'll come back to these later. Let's go ahead. And one of the things that I'm going to talk about throughout is the important role that these boards have actually in transmitting what I'm calling an embodied approach to Islamic learning. The boards remain a crucial support for writing, even as students get further and further advanced and start to use paper. The boards are there often as a symbol of the schools. And indeed, in the Cahiers Ponty, this was one of the main illustrations that students drew in their notebooks, was they drew pictures of alluwahs. Go ahead. So to get to the heart of this argument about embodiment that I really just alluded to so far, that's what the first substantive chapter of the book is about, and it's framed by this hadith: if the Quran were untanned, hide, and were thrown into a fire, it would not burn. One of the most controversial elements around Quran schooling today is the two most controversial elements are depicted here. The prevalence of corporal punishment and the practice of mendicancy that's often associated with Quran schooling. This is a early 20th century French postcard by a person called Edouard Herzig, who was a colonial settler in Algeria who did racist caricatures of Muslims. And here is his picture of the Quran school. The teacher is beating a student, the students are bored and falling asleep. And here is a Human Rights Watch, the cover of Human Rights Watch report from, I guess, 2010 or 11, that's called Off the Backs of Children, which is a scathing indictment of mendicancy in Quran schools. It's also astonishingly poorly documented, but that's something that you can read about when you actually get the book. These controversial elements of Quran schooling are when seen against the longer view, and when seen from an internal perspective rather than from a colonial or an essentially modern-day civilizing mission perspective, have a different logic entirely. And there's a specific set of discourses around the role of hardship and actually bodily suffering in the pursuit of knowledge. It's seen as something that's actually fundamentally inseparable from the process of learning itself. And this was something that really came through in the interviews that I did with people who grew up in the schools. They talked about this as actually a positive value. Some people remembered it quite bitterly and still talked about it as a positive value, and still sent their children to Quran school, where they expected corporal punishment to happen, and where they expected at least ritual mendicancy and sometimes actual mendicancy to take place. And actually, the word that they would often use, it's worth noting that the word in Wolof for education is yar. Now, yar means education or moral education, but this is actually an abstract verb that comes from a noun that's much more concrete. We have, I know at least a couple of Wolof speakers in the audience. Anybody know what the original root for yar is?
Yaru.
What does it mean?
Be polite.
This is it's also an extension, to be educated, to be well educated, but it actually comes from a noun. Now, I'll ask another segment of the audience. Is anybody, when they were a child, asked to run out and pick a switch off of a tree? Because I was. And the noun that yar comes from is a noun meaning a lash or a switch. When Wolof speakers were imagining how to describe what education is, they said it's the lash. A child does not know God, but he knows the switch. is a Wolof proverb. If the Quran were on an untanned hide and were thrown into a fire, it would not burn. One of the ways that people talked about this was that I would often hear, when I did interviews, well, the whole left side of my body will never burn in the hellfire, because there isn't a part of the left side of my body that my Quran teacher didn't whip or beat during the time that I was there. And any part of your body that suffers corporal punishment while you're learning the Quran can never burn in the hellfire. That's what people told me repeatedly. Sometimes, and I would go and look this up to try to find it as a hadith, and I couldn't find anything that remotely resembled it until I saw Travis Zade's piece on hadith, and he has this one buried with it. No, this one's actually in the title. If the Quran were on an untanned hide and were thrown into a fire, it would not burn. And that's when I immediately understood the hadith and what was being said. The untanned hide is the skin of the children of Adam. And if you write the Quran on it, you can throw the children of Adam into a fire and they cannot burn. The medieval exegetes, including Ibn Taymiyyah, ironically, who's often claimed as a kind of proto-Salafi, read this to mean that some of them considered it to be a full body absolution for the person who memorized the entirety of the Quran. And this is also very common in Muslim discourse, that one who memorizes the entirety of the Quran is immune from the hellfire. But the way that it came across in interviews and also in the Kaye Ponti was actually as a very specific absolution for the limbs that had been touched and beaten or whipped or had scars. Sometimes people showed me the scars, as if the lash was writing the Quran onto their very flesh, thus sanctifying it. Let's go ahead. We can go ahead again. This was talked about oftentimes, hardship, the yalwan, mendicancy, was talked about as incurring hunger and thirst and difficulty, fatigue, hardship, as well as corporal punishment. And there were many ways that this was discussed: cleansing of the character, breaking of the character, rebuilding of the character, many different forms. But the one that I liked the best was a Quran teacher who in Tijuana, who ran a school that had about 800 children in it. And he said, well, if you have jangale, if you have teaching without ya, if you have discursive teaching, ta'aleem in Arabic, without tarbiyah, without education, he said it's like, here's what he said. He said, imagine your favorite dish. What's your favorite dish? I said, supu kanja or cherembum. These are my two favorite dishes. People in the Senegal will either like or dislike them. He said, now I want you to imagine it spiced just right. Seasoned just like you like it, with just the right amount of every ingredient, and then poured into a filthy bowl. Are you going to want to eat it? He said, that's the similitude of the Quran and the children of Adam. You don't take the verbatim speech of God Most High and dump it into a filthy vessel. You clean the bowl out first. And that's what the process of moral education was meant to do. So cleaning the vessel, filling the child with the word, writing the Qur'an on the body and being of the child. But this focus on embodiment wasn't just about suffering, it was also very sweet. People fondly remembered the sensory experience of memorizing and singing a long song. Oftentimes, they sort of wax nostalgic. Even the ones who were writing in the Cahiers Ponty and just a few years removed from what they often described as a difficult experience, talked about some of the sort of powerful sensory pleasures of learning in this way, of having their minds opened up to God's word. And it became clear that sometimes the references to corporal punishment in Qur'an schooling were being intentionally exaggerated because it was a thing that was supposed to be part of your education, even if it actually wasn't. Go ahead to the next slide. And so I go one more ahead. Yeah. This is a picture of a Qur'an teacher in Futa Toro with his yar. They didn't know I was coming, I just took the picture. This is actually the lash, so it's still green. It could barely hurt anybody, but it has to be there. It's an important symbol of the school. And oftentimes in bigger schools, the older students that have already learned the Qur'an and they're studying the advanced religious sciences will walk between the rows of students with little lashes like this, just cracking them in the air. Cracking them in the air. Just to make sure that the children know that this thing that they're learning is serious and that they're not supposed to be screwing around. Go back one. A quick note in this same chapter. Girls have always been an important component of the Qur'an school. Contingent varying from region to region. Usainu Alidu, who you mentioned earlier, has wonderful numbers on this for Niger. I have some for Senegal from the beginning of the 20th century and down to the present. But one of the things that turns up in a lot of the first-person accounts is that oftentimes girls receive literacy training before boys did. And that this was something that there was a particular gendering of Quranic education. Boys were especially treated harshly. Boys were the only ones that were sent out for mendicancy. Girls were spoken harshly too. Sometimes they were physically disciplined, but girls were never sent to live with a teacher. So they never lived inside the Qur'an school. And oftentimes, since they were day students and the teacher wasn't sure how long they were going to be staying, they would flip, if you can go back to the image of the two Qur'an tablets, they would flip the board over. These are the Qur'an verses, and write the alphabet out in the Abjadiyya order, the numerological order, and then also do basic voweling lessons. So these were the ones that my daughter did. That my daughters did, and this is a very old practice. It's still common. It's something that was described in the first-person account. Often girls were learning this right from the beginning because they were expected to even if they didn't understand Arabic, to write their mother tongues with the Arabic script. So to write Fula, to write Wolof with the Arabic script. And this is often used for all kinds of domestic purposes, in addition to literary purposes. And some of the most important, sort of female scholars have been the daughters of famous Sufi sheikhs who often write not only in Arabic but also particularly write in African languages using the Arabic script. So I'll have to go back ahead to get things moving just a little more quickly. Yeah, so just essentially what I to summarize sort of this aspect is I just break it down. That we've got the 3 R's, quote unquote, reading, writing, and replacing arithmetic, which was the 3rd R when I was a kid. Recitation. It's really focused on recitation, not on anything else. And if I was really doing this faithfully, this recitation would be in front of the other two. This is really the basic goal: recitation, internalization, memorization. But it was always paired with these. Yar, Yelwan. Yelwan is the Wolof word for mendicancy. Yor is a possession, a thing that you have. And this was the term that people often used to refer to their Quranic knowledge. They talked about it as if it was an inalienable spiritual good that they were holding within them. They were essentially paraphrasing the meaning of Hafiz in Arabic, the one who holds the Quran. But this relationship was also structured, and especially the relationship with the master, and this is the other place where sort of teachers as embodiments of the Quran, because in order to enter the clerical class, to open a Quran school to begin with, you have to memorize the Quran. You don't teach the Quran without knowing it by heart. So the teachers there are themselves there as physical exemplars of the Quran, and therefore there's service and love, service, and gifts that are meant to be provided to this person, because whoever teaches you even a single letter of the Quran is your master. So you owe them a debt that can never be repaid. But it's an approximation of that repayment can be made through these 3 Arabic H's. They're all different H's. One's not even really an H. All right, let's go ahead. I've talked about internalization and embodiment in an abstract sense. The best example of embodiment that I can really give you is the literal one. This is a practice that many of you have probably seen, the practice of drinking the wash water from Qur'anic tablets. And just to return to the sort of questions about syncretism as the predominant framework for understanding African Islam, the normal way that this practice, writing Quran verses on slate boards, which you see in Quran schools, students often drink their lesson. This is often discussed as, so there's Usman Atom has a piece, other people have written about this, as essentially a kind of Africanization of Islam. The treating of the Quranic word as some kind of African fetish, because this is a practice that is not seen, especially in schooling, in many other parts of the Muslim world. Except doing research on early traditions of Islamic knowledge, I found teachers' training manuals from the 9th and 10th centuries CE, written in North Africa, that describe this practice down to a T. In fact, they describe the physical setting of the Quran school with a large bowl in the middle where the children wash the verses off into, and people coming by to drink them from time to time. And there's hadith that go back to the first generation after the time of the Prophet, essentially going back to the 660s, that say the sign of a man worthy of the name man is that you would find him with ink around his lips from licking his tablet. The very thing that we target as the symbol of African syncretism is the very thing that's the evidence of the profound conservatism of this tradition. And it's also a piece of evidence indicating that this embodied approach to internalizing, physically bringing the text into your body, was a thing that was paradigmatic in the early days of Islam. The question then becomes, well, why did other people abandon it? Not why are West Africans doing it? And that's another sort of important part of the story of this book, because it's also a discussion of how epistemological changes in the function and nature of schooling in the so-called Islamic heartlands have essentially washed this style of education completely away. And in so doing, the very places that are imagined to preserve the essence of Islam through some sort of racial alchemy are actually practicing an entirely new set of practices of knowledge transmission. I'll get to that again in the last chapter. Now I really got to speed up. Okay, gotta tell you about this part. Even better than than drinking the water from the slate boards. And it took me a while to wrap my mind around this one. Because there's these hadith that refer to the Prophet Muhammad. This is the name Muhammad pictured here, and it's often described as being a representation of the human form. The first meme as the head, the hat as the arms, the second meme as the midsection, and the del as the two legs. So that the physical form of Muhammad is the Walking Qur'an. It's actually a human form. It's a different version of the calligram that's used here. But this wasn't just something that people idly said. It was something that they acted on. There's these hadith, there's many of them, that describe companions of the Prophet drinking his cupped blood when he was recovering from illness. People know about cupping. It's this. It was common, like bleeding or using leeches. It's common to humoral medical systems throughout the world. There are many instances that describe the Prophet sick, being cupped, and then the people who cupped him taking the blood and drinking it and bringing it into their bodies. Now, the Quran explicitly forbids the consumption of blood. So some people try to deny the validity of these hadith, but there's too many of them with too many different people involved. Where there's this much smoke, there has to be some kind of fire. So one of the things that I found really interesting was that I realized that the circumstances described in each one of these hadith precisely mirrored the descriptions about what to do with the wash water from Qur'an tablets. They have the same language. The ones about what to do with the wash water from the Qur'an tablets say, well, you have to find a place where no one will ever step on it. You have to pour it out in the woods somewhere where you know human beings won't go, because it shouldn't be soiled by something impure. Or oftentimes in Qur'an schools, people told me that they would actually bury it under the dudal, under the hearth, because no one would ever touch it. The hadith about the consumption of the Prophet's blood follow these. They're not the same wording, but they're the same principle. The person says, well, the Prophet asked them, well, what did you do with the blood? And the person says, yeah, I put it in a safe place. I didn't want any animals or birds to, or people to soil it. And the Prophet says to them, maybe you drank it. And yes, I drank it. Go, for you have saved yourself from the fire. That's how two of the different versions end. Now, is it that you've saved yourself from the fire because you've told me the truth, or is it that you've saved yourself from the fire because if the Qur'an were on an untanned hide and were thrown into a fire, it would not burn? There's other hadith from the Battle of Uhud that say that there was a person who, when the Prophet was injured, sucked the blood from his wound, and the Prophet said, you're immune from the fire. The body of the Prophet is being equated to the Quranic text itself. And in the classic, sort of piece of irony, this has been the case for Muslim scholars throughout history. I talk about the fact that there was a riot to get the wash water that was used to wash Ibn Taymiyyah's corpse in the 14th century. I talk about the fact that now in Jorbel, at the place where Amadou Bamba used to make his ablutions, there's a huge hole because people have been coming to gather the sand that captured the water that rolled off his limbs. The dark liquid that erases the Qur'an from the slate boards, the dark liquid that courses through the veins of the Walking Qur'an, the dark liquid that courses through the veins of the true saints. Ahmed Tijani, there's stories about Sidi Ali at-Tamasini, one of his first disciples, drinking his blood when he was ill. All of these things are being implicitly equated with the text of the Qur'an itself. Let's go ahead. So the body is text, teaching the text via the body. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this particular chapter, but it's essentially one that frames subsequent chapters. The goal now that that the sketch of this epistemology of embodiment is in place is to bring it into dialogue with West African history and to show how occupational specialization as a way of organizing society. People often talk about West African societies as caste societies, but they were societies that segregated spatially even before they were hierarchically organized on the basis of occupation. The basic argument is that the logic of West African occupational specialization and this epistemology of embodiment came together to make clerical lineages that were essentially seen as living embodiments of the faith itself and the book itself. And that the logic of their craft was quite different than the craft of griots or blacksmiths. Every male member and many female members had to learn the Qur'an. And the primary vocation was teaching. So these clerical families produce far more Qur'an teachers than any given locale could ever conceivably use. And so they send people out to neighboring villages, open Qur'an schools, and essentially do the work of spreading Islam through essentially a teaching missionization in a region that did not suffer the military conquests that brought Islam to the parts of North Africa. The ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr, and it was the ink of the scholar, not the blood of martyrs, that implanted Islam in West Africa. Let's go ahead. I talk a lot about the specifics of the making of this clerisy. You can ask me about it later. I want to keep moving so I can get to the best of the chapters in the book, I think. One of the things that happens in a formative period is that there's a modus vivendi that's worked out between religious scholars and temporal authorities. Temporal authorities are not meant to put their hands on clerical communities. And clerics are meant to leave the realm of politics to kings. This is something that you see in the earliest sources on Ghana, in the spatial separation, not of the Muslim town and the pagan town, but of the Muslim town and the king's town. It's something that you see represented in a number of places. I talk about this in the previous chapter, rereading some of the Tariqa Sudan, the Tariqa Fatash, especially for places like Jaga and Kabara, which serve as really important clerical centers and which are described in those medieval sources as being a place where even if you killed the son of the king, he could not pursue you for blood money if you were within Jaga or Kabara. Kings have no purchase within clerical havens. Well, at the end of that earlier period, especially in the 17th century, with the rise of the Atlantic slave trade, the meaning and social function of clerical communities is going to change dramatically. Because if clerical communities are safe havens where political authorities cannot pursue people, they're going to become really, really popular when kings that call themselves Muslims start trading their own believing peasants for guns and rum. There's a number of sources that illustrate this. You can, I can detail them if you like in the Q&A. But essentially, there's a lot of evidence that it's in the middle of the 17th century and later that clerical communities start to swell. Senegambian Muslims start to take on a different sort of engagement with Islam through a new kind of physical proximity with clerical communities. I talk about a revolutionary movement in the 1670s, which has been described in other places, which I sort of rewrite it. The so-called War of the Marabouts. A few people will know what I'm talking about, some won't. Doesn't start with Nasir ad-Din in the Sahara. It starts with a Wolof cleric called Njai Sal in Kajor in the 1650s, and doesn't reach maturity till the 1670s. But this logic of every Muslim movement has to move from Arab to African, it has to move from north to south, cause people to miss a bunch of sources that have been right in front of them for 30 years that say this. But the focus of this particular chapter is a much more famous and ultimately successful revolutionary movement that coalesces a number of Senegambian concerns with the new Atlantic political economy and that is rooted in clerical communities. This is the revolution. It starts with the revolution in Futa Toro in the 1770s. And to quickly sketch the outline of the chapter, basically the idea once the Walking Qur'an was in place was to say, well, what if you try to see history through this lens? What might you see? And I thought, there are all these stories about the enslavement of Qur'an reciters being proximate cause for rebellions. And so I just started counting them in secondary sources, in European travelers' accounts, in the Arabic histories, in the oral traditions, and I ended up coming up with at least 40 different individual incidences and something like 200 Quran reciters specifically that are mentioned, where when someone who is a cleric and often identified as a Quran reciter is captured and sold as a slave, and that leads directly to a rebellion, or even in the case of Futa Toro, to a revolution. And I said, well, of course, if the people are the books, then this is a desecration of the Book of God. If Muslims get upset about lunatics wanting to burn paper copies of the Quran, what's going to happen when generation after generation, the living exemplars of God's verbatim speech are marched off in chains? Eventually people are going to say, I've had enough of this. And they're going to break with clerical traditions of pious distance from power. And they're going to say, if these are the kings that we're left with, no more kings. What ultimately becomes the revolution in Futa Toro, which is a story that many of you know in parts, has been nationalized. It's been told as the national hymn of a particular ethnic polity, but at its outset it was a multi-ethnic and multi-racial clerical movement that struggled against the enslavement of Muslims by their rulers. It incorporated Mandingo, Soninke, Wolof, Fula, Berber, Arab clerics within it. And it ultimately, if you can go ahead, it ultimately ends up producing, and this is something that I was able to confirm through new archival research in London, which, by the way, at the time of this revolution at the end of the 18th century, Senegal was a British colony, and the Senegalese historians had not gone to do research on the revolution in Fouta Toro there. They'd been sticking with the tried and true French archives. But the British sources very clearly tell you that not only did Almami Abdul Qadir Khan, the protagonist after Cherno Suleiman Baal, the founder of this movement, not only did he prohibit the passage of slaves through his polity, not only did he prohibit the enslavement of Muslims by Muslims, but that he freed any slave who would recite a verse of the Qur'an in his territories. I marshal all the evidence from those English sources and also from the French slave trading sources, which, by the way, have also been hiding in plain sight, because they tell you repeatedly that this man abolished not only the slave trade, but he abolished slavery. And the discourse that Islamic law enshrines slavery as part and parcel of the Islamic tradition has made this too invisible. In spite of the fact that the founder of the modern British abolitionist movement, Reverend Thomas Clarkson, knew the Almami Abdul Qadir by name, and he wrote in his first book on the abolition of the slave trade, he gave he describes him in a number of points through the book, but he gives him the last word. The final paragraph of the book says, refers to the wise and virtuous Almami, who has the courage to do what the sovereigns of Europe don't, and who is a lesson to them in freedom, liberty, religion, and justice. He's arguing for the first meeting of the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade in 1787. Almami Abdul Qadir Khan has already abolished slavery 10 years before that. And I'm pretty sure, I put out the evidence for this as well, that part of his rationale is that the attacks that are coming from Moorish raiders from across the Senegal River, first of all, they're actually being funded by the British. That's in their records also. But the way that he turns the battle against the Hassaniya Arabs that are raiding Fouta Toro is that he offers freedom to their slaves who will fight against them. And he frees the slaves in Fouta and re-establishes them in villages on the other side of the river. It's the Lincoln move, right? Except it's not the Lincoln move. This is the oldest trick in the book in Atlantic Africa. Ana Njinga is doing this in West Central Africa in the 1620s. She frees the slaves of the Portuguese and arms them against the Portuguese. So anyway, ask me questions about it later. I'm running out of time. Let's go ahead. Okay. I'll stop here just for a quick moment, because part of what I'm doing in really delving into the primary source material on this particular movement is to also link it to others. It's gone unnoticed that the Sokoto Jihad begins when 300 of Usman Dan Fodio's Qur'an reciters are captured by the rulers of Gobir, and instead of being ransomed, they're sold as slaves. And that's the moment when skirmishes and negotiations end. And Usman Dan Fodio says, we ain't got nothing to talk about no more, it's time to fight. I follow the story through the Fouta Revolution to an important 19th century Wolof cleric. I can't go into details about his life here, you can ask me about it later. Also to El Hadj Umar Tall, but the chapter ends with Amadou Bamba. Because the beginning of the Fouta Revolution is told in Sheikh Musa Kamara's account that Cherno Suleiman Baal is crossing the Senegal River and he hears a man reciting the Quran beautifully, melodiously. And he walks around to the boat and sees that the man is in chains. And he's with his disciples, and he has one of his disciples who's a wrestler go onto the boat and beat the man up, the men that are holding him up, and release the man and set him free. And the revolution starts 6 months later. Well, there's a very famous story within the context of the Muride that in 1875, Amadou Bamba walked into his father's courtyard and he heard two slaves reciting the Quran. And then he saw that they were in chains. And he went to his father to ask him what the meaning of this was. And the argument that I make in the chapter is that Bamba's characteristic stance of defiance of political authorities is framed in this moment. He's the heir to this long-term legacy. This is the moment that he decides, he starts slipping notes into his father's books, saying the most honest Qadi will be judged by God. Because his father is one of the Qadis for the Damal of Kajor, who, by the way, through all of these chapters, has essentially been the arch enemy of the clerical class. He's responsible for enslaving hundreds and murdering hundreds of clerics in retribution for these rebellions. So we'll go ahead from there. That takes us up to the end of the 19th century. The chapter that follows it also deals with the theme of social inequality, and the dates here are wrong, sorry. This should be from 1890 to 1945. The hadith that frames it, the nobility of my community, are the people of the Qur'an. The basic argument is that the one good thing that comes from French colonialism is the formal legal abolition of slavery. Now, it's a half-assed abolition, and it's a cynically practiced one, but it's just enough room for enslaved people, for casted people, and also for women, for all of the people who have been held at arm's length from Islamic education to start making new kinds of claims for Muslim dignity. And the main way that they do that, I argue, is through insisting on Qur'anic education. And from within this epistemology of embodiment, my basic argument is that this is not social climbing or even just education. This is redefining the very substance of the self. The slave or the casted person is one whose body is imagined as impure in societal discourses in Senegambia. Sometimes people still won't touch a thing that's from a griot's house. Marriages between casted families and slave families and free families are fraught to the present. And it's because there's a perceived bodily taint that's associated with these statuses. Well, if drinking the Qur'an and memorizing the Qur'an makes you into the Qur'an, cannot one remake an impure body as a body of knowledge? And that's the challenge that this demand for education poses. And what happens is that Sufi leaders, like Ahmadou Bamba, like El Hadj Malick Sy, like El Hadj Abdoulaye Niasse, tap into this demand. The popular Sufism that we see happening at the end of the 19th century in Senegal is largely built through democratizing access to basic Islamic education. If you go to a Muride community, nobody asks who your father was. They say, are you going to go to the Qur'an school? Are you going to go to the field? And are you going to bring a gift to your sheikh? Ahmadou Bamba would intentionally take well-born people and make them go fetch water when they submitted themselves to him. And if a former slave memorized the Qur'an, he would make him the imam. El Hadj Malick Sy, in urban context, behaved in similar fashion. So the success of Sufism, and Sufism is really successful in Senegal. The recent Pew polls say 92% of Senegalese identify themselves with one or another Sufi order. In neighboring Mali, it's 30%. Nigeria, it's in the same ballpark. The argument is essentially that it's the efforts of these particularly creative people in responding to this demand that leads to the Sufi success in Senegambia. Because after all, the word for Serin, the word for sheikh in Wolof, Serin, just means teacher originally. The Sufi sheikh is just the new Qur'an teacher. The Qur'an teacher has always been the embodiment of Islam, the embodiment of the Qur'an, the embodiment of Islamic knowledge. It's just now it has a different institutional framework. Let's go ahead. The challenge to this Sufi success and to this educational revolution comes not from the French. I argue really that French schooling does not do a lot to challenge this epistemology of embodiment. It comes from modern Arab schools that establish themselves, that are importing a kind of Salafi, Wahhabi brand of Islam, one that ultimately, I trace this out, is rooted in middle 19th century educational reforms that are explicitly designed to modernize Islamic education, that are explicitly designed to make Muslim schools more like Western schools. But by the end of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, that initial engagement, the roots of it are now erased, and people say this is returning to the pure sources of Islam. Even though we're not sitting on the ground with wooden tablets across our legs, we're sitting at desks with blackboards, and we're learning geography and mathematics instead of memorizing the Qur'an. Even if you pay attention to modernist Muslim political discourse, or even the contents of their rhetoric, you'll get one sense. But if you actually look at how they educate people, you'll understand that their approach to knowledge is a particular branch of 19th century post-Enlightenment rationalism. And it's quite different from the embodied approach that we see here. The two pieces, I love this hadith, also from Travis Zadeh. A man without any bit of the Qur'an in his belly is like a broken down house. Licking the slate board clean. The sign of a man worthy of the name man is that you would see him with ink around his lips from licking the revelation. Rashid Rida and Saeed Qutb, who I use sort of as foils essentially in this chapter because I don't really care that much about modernist Islam, but they're interesting points in their biographies. Each of them, first of all, is the first generation in his town to not go to Quran school. They're from the first generation to go to the modern schools. And Saeed Qutb is actually forced by his father because he's so badly behaved to go to the Hafiz one time. He goes one day and he records that he was disgusted because at the end of the day they wanted him to lick the lesson off of his tablet, and that was it for him. He never went back. Rashid Rida in his tafsir of the Quran says of the drinking of the water from the slate boards, I do not care whether or not it has a foundation in the early tradition. For me, it's a matter of excessive devotion. He actually says this. Don't care whether it came from the time of the Salaf. Don't care if it's Salafi or not. It's not knowing. Knowing is something that you do with your mind. It's not something that you bring into your body. Knowing is something that's produced through discourse and debate and argument. Knowing is something that's produced through understanding the meanings of the Quran, not from ingesting it. This approach gets imported into West Africa through essentially return of pilgrims, but also through people who study abroad, and there comes to be a sort of struggle over how epistemology is going to be defined, and ultimately the argument of the chapter is that the flexibility inherent in the traditional model really shows through at this particular moment, because it selectively starts to appropriate little bits and pieces of the educational method from other schools and continues to sort of stay ahead of the curve. In places like Mali, in places like Nigeria, modernized Arabic schools have really they are now beginning to seriously outpace the number of people that are taught in Quran schools, but partially because Sufi orders are largely responsible for preserving this traditional approach to knowledge. In Senegal, they've actually fared quite well, and there's actually a lot of evidence that Quran schooling is expanding in Senegal, not getting smaller. And this is something that I have material on, but it's also something that I've just plainly seen from going to Senegal the first time in 1996 down to the present. The higher study, the study of the Islamic religious sciences is different. I think that this faces serious challenges nowadays, but basic Quran schooling is going quite strong and likely to do so into the future, which is the point of the conclusion. The prophets sometimes like to talk about the end of days, and Muslims love to speculate wildly about what he meant. And so I have a little fun with wild speculation on a particular hadith. The people of the West will keep triumphantly following the truth until the hour arises. Now, this is one that has been discussed. Some people thought that this was meant to refer to Muslim Spain, and that they thought that the reconquest was the end of the world. Some modern Muslims think that this refers to the West, and that Islam will become implanted in the West. I, with tongue firmly planted in cheek, but just in order to make a point, the farthest west that the original Walking Qur'an could have walked before he encountered an impassable ocean would have been the very spot on which the city of Dakar is now built. There is no further western point in the old world. And in that far westernmost stretch of the world, people are remaining committed to teaching the Quran this very old-fashioned way, still using these wooden tablets, still ingesting their lessons. And from a very long time, and I talk to get a little anthropological in this particular chapter, I talk about how Quran schools have essentially, from different periods, been used as an index of the social health of Muslim society in West Africa. In Ibn Battuta, you can see this. You can see it down into the current period as well. People took the temperature of Muslim society by the health of their Quran schools. Quran schooling was the key symbol of Muslim identity, and people judge their society by the state of the schools. And so I asked the question, well, what does it say about the state of the Ummah if these schools have largely disappeared from other places? What does it say about the kind of an epistemology? And I asked, the question. I said, well, do modern Muslims really not love the Qur'an enough to lick it off of a tablet? Have Western notions of hygiene and propriety and discourse as education, completely reprogram the way that people come to know? And the argument that I ultimately, sort of close upon is that this particular style of schooling has suffered attacks from a colonial state. It's suffered attacks from all kinds of external sources. It's suffered attacks, frankly, from slave trading kings. It's been around for a long time, and it's not going anywhere. It's a major index of Muslim identity in this part of the world, and it's been a profoundly durable one, and it's likely to stay so. So whatever sort of peace needs to be made with Qur'an schooling, it's going to be one that has to take seriously this long-term history and this deep societal commitment to this peculiarly Islamic way of knowing. And I'll stop with that and answer questions.
Thank you so much.
Sorry for going so long.
Passion very visible.
I'm going to suggest that we take like 15 minutes.
That sounds
questions.
wonderful.
And why don't you go ahead and
Field them? Sure. Show of hands. Come on. There was a lot to respond to. Yeah. Tim.
One of the things that struck me as you were talking, having just spent the summer in Zanzibar, is the contrast with East Africa, where in fact Salafism is now quite dominant.
Sure.
And the idea of having girls and boys together in the same classroom, for example, in the picture there is possibly, particularly girls who were uncovered, since at this stage they would already be fully
girls don't usually get covered, and they don't usually get segregated until 11 or 12.
Yeah, in Zanzibar it's now down to like 3 and 4. So I'm just sort of curious about if you could talk more about the growth of Salafism, is why it's not growing more. What are their schools like? How do they contrast with the Quranic schools? And why isn't it more deeply rooted? Maybe beyond Senegal, because as you say, in Mali and other parts of West Africa, Sufism is not as dominant.
I mean, I don't want to overstate, the idea that they're out there. Frankly, I think that a lot of there are many places where this style of schooling is continuing to thrive. It's just not immediately visible in a lot of places. If you read Louis Brenner's, very nice book, Controlling Knowledge on Mali, I mean, he gives the sense that really that the new kind of school is really replacing the old one. But other people doing ethnographic work in Mali, suggest that this really might not quite be the case, or maybe it's not as pronounced in some areas. So I don't want to just say Senegal is entirely exceptional, but ultimately, what happens in Senegal is that in the 1950s, kind of returnees from Al-Azhar, returnees from North Africa, returnees from the pilgrimage, the first thing that they always do is set up schools. They have few political activities or ambitions, and this is actually a very typical pattern throughout West Africa with so-called reform movements, is that if they're usually studied as political movements, but their first actions are almost always educative, because they're trying to build a constituency of their own, and they're trying to sap a constituency of alternative intellectuals. So that's a huge part of their activities. There's a full-scale war on Qur'an schools in the 50s and 60s from anti-Sufi groups. And ultimately what happens is, because of the social power of the Sufi orders, they get isolated rather quickly. And ultimately many of them sort of go through what's sometimes referred to in an American context as Salafi burnout. As they actually grow into mature human beings and want to become elders in their society, they have to, and Robert Launay writes about this very nicely for Côte d'Ivoire actually, they start to, to soften their stance with respect to certain things, because the societal structures are what they are. You can't be a respected elder if you protest spending on marriage, as a typical Salafi, critique, or you insist that if the Salatul Fati, a litany that's associated with the Tijaniya, is recited at a wedding, that it's invalid. It makes you really unpopular and a bad grown-up. So there's a kind of generational shift that comes, but it's ultimately, the argument is that it's the success of these of Sufi-run schools in adapting to the new input that ultimately makes Qur'an schools continue to be appealing. One of the things that happens, for example, is that people take this practice of flipping the slate board over, and they start using the Aleph, Bet, Teth, order for the alphabet with children at younger and younger ages, and also with advanced students. With advanced students, so they can read a dictionary. With younger students, so that they can read just as well as the students that are being produced by the modern Arabic schools. But to talk about how they work, they're very different schools. They often spend an hour a day, sometimes only 3 hours a week, on Qur'an memorization. They're essentially European schools, but they have religion as one of their topics. And part of the argument in the book is that it's actually this framing of God's verbatim speech as one subject that's just like the other ones that you're studying, that you have a kind of discursive mastery over, and that you can sit on high and read it and then close your book and go on to geography, instead of having to lick that off of the board and understand that this knowledge is not like that knowledge. The thing that I use in the last chapter is to say, look, even if you don't believe that the Quran is God's verbatim speech, even if you don't believe that God's verbatim speech is capable of producing results in the body by its own agency, we would all agree that the act of imbibing your lesson every day over the span of a number of years leaves people feeling like they're charged with a particular kind of knowledge. It leaves people with specific sorts of dispositions to knowledge. And that's what's not being produced through these new kinds of schools. And so they often end up, with a kind of black and white, I'm right, you're wrong, the law of the excluded middle. If two people arrive at different conclusions, one has to be wrong, the other has to be right, or both have to be wrong. Whereas in the classical tradition, people can arrive at different conclusions and both be right as long as they follow the correct process. So that there's this kind of exclusionary form of rationalism which creeps into people's thinking. And I don't think that it's, unrelated to the intolerance that is often expressed, through these Salafi and fundamentalist forms of Islam. It's an insufficient answer, but.
Professor Ware, this was very, very helpful. I think for all the students here that are studying Islam West Africa, this was very, very, this was great. It was really. My question, I have two questions. The first, you mentioned sort of the importance of Sufis and Sufism in Western Africa in preserving this type of Quranic education, as well as sort of the inverse, right? And so I think you mentioned the durability or the salience of 19th century post-Enlightenment rationalism. And so I'm wondering if you can problematize that a bit more in the sense that, of course, we have Sufis in the peninsula, we have Sufis in South Asia, yet we don't perhaps see the same type of Quranic education or the same type of resiliency of this education. At the same time, of course, we have post-Enlightenment rationalist thought interpreted in different ways in West Africa. So as much as you can, sort of what accounts for the durability of this type of education in places like Senegal and Mauritania in a way that we don't really see in Yemen or Saudi or Iraq or Lebanon? And then the second question, you mentioned the higher Islamic sciences that may be under a bit more threat or perhaps aren't growing as quickly as basic Quranic education. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Definitely. So the way that I would sort of answer the first part of your question, and it's a good question, is by, so this is the payoff of doing history over the long durée. For me, a huge part of the success and durability of these schools is the way that they're tied to a kind of democratization of Muslim identity at the end of the 19th century. the exact same process doesn't happen in some other parts of West Africa. So what ultimately ends up happening is you have, I think, a mass appeal for Qur'an schooling that takes place in Senegal. And I'm not going to argue that post-Enlightenment rationalism is absent. Obviously, that wouldn't be accurate. There are many very, very French-minded people in Senegal. But I would insist actually that it's the persistence of these schools as a basic element of socialization that is acting as a kind of, people actually talked about this. You know, people said that, you know, well, I spent, you know, 3 years in the Quran school, and after that I went to the French school, but everything that I learned after that was conditioned by what I already had learned at the Quran school. That I assimilated this way of knowing instead of having it assimilate me. So ultimately, I'm really making very much a social historian argument that it's the fact that many people from all different strata of society start to get educated in these schools. The schools themselves expand in their reach, and because of this, you know, they act as a sort of bulwark against not against the advent of such ideas, but rather how they're actually assimilated, and that's what the last chapter, not the conclusion, is about. It's about the production of a kind of hybrid epistemology that's being made through the choices of parents who see benefits in different kinds of schools and different kinds of approaches, but they want this kind of schooling for their children, so they insist on it. They send their children to Quran school during the vacation time from the French school. They fake their children's birth certificates so that they go to Quran school until they're 8, but then they tell the French school that they're still 7, so that they can start on time. People make all kinds of accommodations because they've said that this kind of schooling is important, and when people go through it, it colors their disposition towards these other ways of knowing. Remind me of the second question.
The
higher learning.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I gathered a lot of material on the teaching of the religious sciences and can't use any of it in this book because this book is already, you know, long. But I've got a graduate student who's working on the Majlis al-Ilm, the Janga Ham is what it's usually called in Wolof, the study of knowledge as opposed to memorization. My overall sense is that the requirements of clerical families who have aspirations of being public intellectuals have increasingly pushed people towards diploma granting institutions for higher education. They have not abandoned other forms. Can you go back on the slides? Yeah, here, this one. This is a traditional majlis in a village called Bokijawe. I was telling you about it before we came in. There's about 2,000 students at this one school studying the traditional religious sciences. They don't get any diploma for it. No institution will accredit them. What they get is an ijazah. They get an authorization to teach. And I didn't have enough time, but this is also part of my argument about embodiment, is that what an ijazah is meant to communicate is it's meant to communicate time spent in the physical presence of an authorized transmitter of the knowledge.
So can I say in a school like this, would there be one instructor?
Yes.
Who's okay.
But people can be there for different to learn different books. This one, they were studying. It's a sharh of the Mukhtasar of Khalil ibn Ishaq. It's a Maliki fiqh text. And just for this, you can't see the rest of the room, but there's about 150 people just in this room, and they're coming from, you know, as far away as Sudan and Cameroon and all over the place. So they're still coming, but there used to be lots of places like this, and there aren't as many anymore. There's some in Mauritania, there's some in Senegal, there's some in Nigeria. I mean, I don't talk about it in the book, it's anecdotal information. But the ijazah that is granted by such places isn't something that has, you know, currency in modern educational institutions. So this is, I think, what's driving, you know, the challenge. However, you know, even without any real, you know, sort of incentives, actually, other than the knowledge itself, and other than the fact that this is, you know, conceived of as genuine and authentic way of training, people still go, and lots of people still go, and many people mix. You know, many people will go to a diploma granting institution. And some of the Sufi orders have actually been at the forefront of developing those. Al-Azhar Institute in Tuba is one. The Nyas branch of the Tijani has been very aggressive in developing modern schools, but they pair it also with traditional study with sheikhs where you're getting the.
Actually, I had just some very simplistic, basic clarifying questions. Starting with your...
I talk fast, so that happens to me a lot.
The Ponti
Yes.
Veda, Kaye, is that a code word, William Ponti?
That's the one, yeah.
So these are people who had gone to the school for forming these Francophone
Yes.
elites for the empire,
Mm-hmm.
but they had this other education. So
Yes.
there's this blending.
Yes.
If they are writing things that are as long as you said,
Yes.
this has stayed with them,
Yes.
which they take into being the Francophone
Yes.
elites.
Yes. Can I say something just to that particular point? There's many of them where they're actually arguing with their teachers. They're responding to the caricature that they know the teacher has in mind about Qur'an schools. And so some of them are subtly doing it. Some of them are actually sort of aggressively doing it. Like the Qur'an school is misunderstood. This was a great experience. And others are really quite brainwashed. Yeah. But go ahead. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
So then I was wondering, when you were talking about the modern schools, I was trying to figure out, are you talking about the Franco-Arab schools?
Yeah.
And isn't it possible that people do both? Like Mama Chota, she
Absolutely.
does,
Absolutely.
she has 3 models
Yes. Yeah.
of schools. And
Many people do. And especially.
so I was wondering how widespread is it an either or how widespread is the multiple
Yeah.
coexisting?
It's widespread, and that's actually, this image is accompanied with the discussion of that in the book. So the place that I used to really highlight this particular point is Medina by Kaolack, and the schools that are run, that were run by Sheikh Hassan Sise, now run by Sheikh Tijani Sise, where there's this blending. There's children learn Qur'an from wooden slate boards. Some also, the older students start to have mushaf, they have books. But then upstairs, there are classrooms where they sit up, so they're deciding, essentially that certain elements of this education have to be kept. You can't have a person without it. But there is utility to some parts of these other methods, especially if one has actually undergone the character formation that's associated with Qur'an schooling. So there is, as I said, very much a hybridization of strategic approaches to acquiring Islamic knowledge. But what's striking is how often they're centered around Qur'an schooling. That this is the thing that can't be pulled out of that equation. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems, first, all these different countries are different. A place like Niger, which has such a low literacy rate, how one sees the blending, the mix, and the relative weight might be quite different.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up literacy rates, because that's another thing, is that that picture where the students are being beaten and not learning anything, that's kind of the image of Qur'an schooling. There's research from the late 1990s in Futa Toro, from the early 1990s in Tuba, that amongst men who had spent as little as 18 months, in Qur'an school, that there was something like a 60% literacy rate in either Wolofal or Arabic or both. Literacy is really, really wide, and that's actually another one of the ways that you can see the expansion in this basic form of education, is that Wolofal literacy is very, very high. It's higher, I think, now than at any previous point. It's much higher than French. And there are often now policy debates, about having Arabic and Ajami literacy counted for, because you would shoot right up in the UNESCO rankings if you just counted all the people that actually know how to read.
Have you seen our Wolofal workbook?
Oh, well, I forgot. I shouldn't say anything about Wolofal. I'm in
Well,
Father's.
not here,
I'm in
he
Father's.
doesn't come in on Thursday.
I'm on his turf, and
But we
transgressed
give
even
you
by
a
saying
copy
Wolofal
of-
in his house.
It was interesting also
No,
that you were saying that girls were
Yes.
trained even earlier
Very.
in
Yeah.
literacy.
It's
And
very
they're
clear
just,
evidence for it.
using it for Wula or whatever.
Yeah, and well, so many are using it just for Walla, for Fula, but A point that I make at some length is that the gender structure of Quran schools is such that, well, there's two important things to say. The first is that many girls go to Quran school, but the girls that become religious scholars are almost always the daughters of religious scholars, because of the fact that you don't send girls outside of the house to be consigned to the care of a teacher. So if a girl can't receive a thoroughgoing training in a number of disciplines within her family, she won't get it. And so there are many girls that are Quran memorizers and can read well, but they haven't had training in the Islamic religious sciences, and they're not going to be people who are going to write. Unless they come from these clerical families. It's very unusual. So that many of the most famous female scholars, all of the famous female scholars in West Africa, are daughters of important clerics. Nana Asma'u, Sayyidah Maryam Inyas, who ran a Quran school in Dakar that was famed for being the best for Quran memorization. For 60 years she ran the school. Well, she's not actively running it anymore, but no, it's not closed. Astaghfirullah. No, it will never close. But she's no longer actively running it. Sohna Muslim Mbake, Muslimatu Mbake, one of Amadou Bamba's daughters, wrote both in Arabic and also in Wolofal. Maimouna Mbake also similarly so. So they tend to be, and it's for this structural reason. They're not getting that education. Now, the other thing that I'll say is that I'm pretty convinced, although I can't fully document it, so I say I think this but don't know it, that much of what's driving an overall increase in the number of girls in Quran schools over the course of the 20th century is that girls from low status groups are getting more education. Because if you break down the numbers, the places where I have detailed numbers for the late 19th century, early 20th century, they tend to be 20%, 25% of the contingent, 30% of the contingent in a Quran school are girls. And the discourse that's surrounding this is essentially that all of the freeborn males go to Quran school. But I also know that many casted kids are going to Quran schools, and some slaves and former slaves are going to Quran school. My suspicion is that the numbers, the gender breakdown is the way it is in the early period because girls from low status groups don't go. And that's much of what changes after 1950, is that increasingly girls from previously enslaved or casted backgrounds are going to Quran schools with much greater frequency. I can't prove it, but I'm pretty sure that that's what's happening. Otherwise, it's just really hard to explain the dramatic demographic increase, because there's many places now where girls are more than 50% of the contingent. Yeah?
You had a very brilliant presentation, but doing Islam or writing about the Quran in a contemporary period like this one, there is a question that is boiling in my mind.
Which is?
I come from Cameroon.
Oh, okay.
And for the last 20 years, we've seen an increase in the number of Quran schools.
Mm.
Maybe it holds in Cameroon, it equally holds in other parts of Africa. And at the same time, we've seen an increase in radical Islamism.
Mm.
I don't know whether the schools are contributing to the emergence of radical Islamism or vice versa. I don't know which one is influencing which.
Yeah.
For example, during the last crisis in Mali, it was reported that children were recruited from the Quran school to fight. So, has the Quran school become a recruiting ground for?
Well, I can't speak to Cameroon specifically. Similar charges, are leveled in other places. Frankly, this was a charge that was routinely leveled by the French also in the 19th century, that Quran schools were breeding grounds for little jihadists that would fight against French occupation. The question, I would actually answer your question with a question. These Quran schools that are supposedly breeding grounds for terrorists, oftentimes these are not Quran schools at all. Like the question that I would ask is, are they sitting on the ground or are they sitting in a chair? Are they sitting with a wooden tablet laid across their legs? Or is there a teacher, telling them what's what from a book? A huge part of my point is that not all Quran schools are created equal, and that one kind of Quran school is essentially a continuation of a very old humanistic tradition of teaching within Islam, and the other is essentially a very modern phenomenon with oftentimes tied to very modern political goals and political ambitions that frankly were anathema for the clerical class within West Africa for almost 1,000 years. And that the only thing that brought clerics to really struggle for temporal power was the travesty of the massive expansion of the Atlantic slave trade. That this was the thing that pulled clerics into a struggle for power. One in which they often become the thing that they fought against. I talk about that in the book as well. One of Amami Abdul Qadir Khan's own sons is responsible for reestablishing slavery in Futa Toro after his father is assassinated. He tries to go get his hands on people who had been living free for 30 years and tries to put them to work on fields, and they've never worked on fields in their life. They fought for the freedom of his country. And actually they flee to villages and are protected by villagers from re-enslavement because everybody knows they're not slaves. So my point is just to say that reformist Islam is often tied up with all kinds of political ambitions, but the way that it teaches people and the way that its schools work is dramatically different from the schools that I'm describing, and it has to be so, frankly.
Okay, if there are no more questions, I think we should close. If people want to informally ask questions.
Yeah,